on the firm, a very important firm. I'm delighted to be hosting this book launch from CASEI at University of Lancaster, and to introduce you to Laura. She's a lecturer in media in sociology here at Lancaster. She's also doing many other things, director of the Centre of Gender and Women's Studies and the MA lead for the Gender and Women's Studies programme. We're going to be discussing her very challenging book, Running the Family Firm, how the royal family manages its image and our money, note the our, and it's published with Manchester University Press. And if you want a discount, log into the Manchester University Press site. I found this on Twitter, Laura, and use FIRM21 to get your discount. But I do think people should read it, so that's not just a joke. It's a very important book to read, because actually this comes out of very substantive research. Laura began this as a PhD funded by the ESRC and the AHRC, and then followed through with a postdoc as well, funded by the ESRC, on the role of the monarchy and its finances and symbolic capital. So it comes from a perspective that takes into account cultural studies and political economy, which is again a really important perspective that combines both. And as Laura points out, it's actually impossible to understand inequality, wealth, property, power and elites in the UK if you don't understand the role of the monarchy. And it's been completely ignored, because really, who wants to study the monarchy? So, you know, hats off to Laura, she's very brave for doing this. But the significance of, you know, rentier capitalism is right bang at the heart of the monarchy. And this book explains that historic role and the significance of it. Now, today we have a great range of speakers, and I'm not going to go through all their books and publications. I'm just going to say who they are and introduce them. First of all, we have Bruce Bennett, film studies scholar extraordinaire, who's written many books. His latest book is on cycling and cinema, which I think is unique in that particular field. He's an expert in visual cultures, representation, screen cultures, and Bruce made a perfect PhD supervisor for Laura because of his expertise, and he did shape the project right from the start. I can feel that when I read that, Laura. He's kind of, you know, he was in there going, what's your research question? So that's Bruce. Then over to Helen Ward. Helen is the most amazing professor of media and cultural studies in the sociology department at Lancaster. Again, I'm not going to cite all of her books, and there's many, and lots of her articles and media posts. But she works on text and audience research, so that really unique combination again of research. And she was the mentor of Laura's ESRC postdoctoral fellowship and a general hero in getting her to actually write the book. And then next up is Valluvan, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick. His most recent book is Clamour of Nationalism, Race and Nation in 21st Century Britain, and again has written extensively around race, Brexit, nationalism, really, really important work. And his work speaks to many of the themes in the book, and actually I'm hoping to have a really critical engagement around ideology and nationalism. Always some very provocative points. We've sadly lost Hannah Hamad, who's had to go into hospital today, so our love and thoughts go out to her and we wish her well. And just to let you know the running order, firstly, Laura will be reading part of a book for 15 minutes, then Bruce will respond, then Helen, then Vallu, and then Laura will answer questions at the end. She may ask some as well. And then Michael will finish in terms of what we're going to do in the future. So over to you, Laura, and thank you very much, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, Bev. Thank you, everybody. That was really nice, Bev. Thank you. So I would just start off just by thanking Bev and Michael for hosting this and for doing the tech, and the speakers Helen, Vallu and Bruce, and Hannah, who couldn't be here. I did ask quite last minute, so I'm really grateful that you could be here, and it's really nice to have you. And I did all my full thanks in the endorsements in the book, but I do just want to say Bruce and Imogen Tyler were my PhD supervisors for this, and a lot of this comes from our conversations. And Helen was my mentor on an ESRC postdoc, which was when I wrote the book, and it really wouldn't exist without those two people. So I do feel like I need to just say thank you, and it's really nice to have you, both of you, here. So I wanted to kind of start off by just quickly saying why I kind of got to this point of writing it, and then I'm going to read some little clips of the book. So I started off with this project on my master's dissertation, and I did my master's dissertation on Kate Middleton and social reproduction and gender and conservatism. And when I was doing that, I kind of realised that there was quite a big gap in research on the royal family more generally. I just couldn't find it. I couldn't find it to use, and that was quite frustrating. And that it kind of just snowballed from there into a PhD project, and then into what this is now. It didn't start off as what this is now at the beginning of the PhD project. I'm sure Bruce will agree it was very different, and it's kind of become what it is. And I think there's also a big gap in elite studies. So obviously elite studies is becoming quite popular in sociology and media studies at the moment. And monarchy is something that isn't typically talked about in those terms. So again, that was kind of another place where I think there's space to talk about the monarchy in these terms that aren't otherwise spoken about. And from conversations with students, I always love teaching this to students because they get really into it, and they kind of say, well, why have we not been taught this before? Why is this not a broad conversation? It's always a really lovely thing to teach. So I think that's kind of how I ended up here and how I ended up writing this. So what I want to do is, if it's going to work, I'm hoping it will, I just want to play, I had some animations made with an animator called Mare Perkins to promote the book, and she was wonderful, and she came up with these really cool designs. So I just wanted to share them with you before we start. So the one I want to share is a film about the firm and about this name that I use in the book, the firm. Can someone just, if you can't hear it, can someone just put their mic on and shout, because I can't see the screen now.
We think of the global wealth elite. We usually think of giants like Amazon or Facebook. But what about the British monarchy? The monarchy is usually positioned as an archaic institution, irrelevant to corporate firms of wealth and power. But the relationship between monarchy and capitalism is as old as capitalism itself. From rent on land and public space, to funding colonial conquests, to using loopholes to avoid paying tax. Running the family firm thinks about the monarchy as a corporation, the firm with corporate investments, wealth, and operational tactics. Who works for the monarchy? Where does its wealth come from? What work does it do? What role does monarchy play in reproducing global inequalities? Running the family firm argues that we cannot talk about inequalities today without talking about the monarchy.
Just try and get this back up, and then I can turn it off. Okay, I should be back now. Is that right? Good, thank you. So what that video kind of showed was this idea of the firm, and the firm is actually quite a common nickname. You'll hear people using it. So the Queen has used it, and Harry and Meghan used it in the Oprah interview, which was really fascinating. But I've kind of used it to get at the idea of them being like a corporation, so comparable to people like Amazon or Apple, and to think about what they do, the work they do, the wealth they have, the people they work for, and how all that interconnects. And we can think about them in this kind of as this form of corporate power. So I'm going to read a couple of portions of the book that I've kind of picked that hopefully tell a bit of a story of these different parts. So the first one is around kind of inequality and around how people want to believe what people want to believe the monarchy is versus what I think it is, if that makes sense. So growing divides between Britain's rich and poor were illustrated viscerally in June 2017, when a reported 80 people died in a fire in the high-rise social housing building Grenfell Tower in the London borough of Kensington and Chelsea. This is an area with extreme inequalities between the poorest and the richest, who live in close proximity. The cladding covering Grenfell Tower's exterior, so it looked more appealing to wealthy neighbours, was highly flammable. used by the management company instead of fireproof alternatives because it was cheaper. As the sociologist Tracy Shildrick notes, the disaster epitomises so much that is unfair and divisive with neoliberal capitalism. Various royal families visited the Grenfell Tower site in the aftermath as part of their philanthropic engagements that they do. Following the Queen's visit, the Daily Mirror published a headline, "A Tale of Two Leaders," which contrasted a photograph of the Queen talking to Grenfell Tower residents with one of then Prime Minister Theresa May at the site when she was flanked by police officers to avoid local and national public anger at the role of government in the Grenfell fire. This commentary seems to present the Queen as the antithesis of the policies that many blame for causing the fire, the austerity policies of the state and the elite power of global investors gentrifying the London property market. The Queen is seen to represent a paternalistic and patronising morality in opposition to the immorality of the new elites. So she embodies values of heritage, history and protection against external threats. Yet Grenfell Tower is less than 2 miles from Kensington Palace, the official London residence of royals, including Prince William and Kate Middleton. This demonstrates a physical proximity between the monarchy, its property portfolio, the casualties of these austerity policies, and the greed of financial capitalism. So in A Tale of Two Leaders, in that newspaper headline, the Daily Mirror fails to identify the Queen as part of those systems of class greed and inequality that facilitated the Grenfell incident. Similarly, when there was the report of the Paradise Papers, which was the monarchy's involvement in trying to avoid tax that were released alongside Amazon and Nike. People's response to the monarchy's exposure in this was one of surprise. So the Labour MP Margaret Hodge said she was furious with the Queen's advisers for bringing her reputation into disrepute, quote, and claimed the Queen would be completely shocked to learn of the schemes. She continued, quote, "The monarchy is one of the most trusted, loved and respected institutions in Britain, and it symbolises the integrity of Britain in the world, and to see it sullied by these sorts of activities is outrageous." So this bewilderment that the monarchy might engage in immoral practices to accumulate wealth is really revealing of its positioning in the public imagination as the exact opposite, right, of these corporate forms of wealth and power. But one argument of this book is that the inequalities inherent to monarchy combine with those of financial capital. And I argue that the monarchy acts as a facade through which the mechanisms of inequality are disguised and naturalised. So that's the first bit I wanted to read, which really kind of frames the idea of inequality and frames the idea of corporate power. The second one I wanted to read is slightly different. So the other element of the book, which comes through, I hope comes through strongly, is this kind of cultural studies element. So my background is in media studies, and what I started off looking at, where the project started, that's where it ended up on inequalities. It started with this idea of media representations of the royal family, particularly through these British cultural studies ideas of like producing consent through media representation. So I'm just going to read a little bit now about power and media. So debates about the place of monarchy in a contemporary mediated society are given context within wider histories of sovereign power. The philosopher Michel Foucault argues that in the Middle Ages, the king was the central character in the entire Western juridical edifice, and the sovereign power functioned through great state apparatus. The sovereign controlled the army and the police, the law was understood to represent the sovereign's will, and the sovereign had the right to take life as punishment. This shifted after the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution in 1688, where James II was overthrown and the Bill of Rights abolished the monarchy's absolute power. And Foucault argues that in the 17th and 18th century, sovereign power as it was known was replaced by a hierarchical observation and normalising judgment, where power was exercised through social production and social service. So this is productive, disciplinary forms of power that circulate throughout the society, that relies in part upon theatre and spectacle to engage and inspire the citizens. But what does it mean to negotiate a form of sovereign power, so a monarchy, at the level of social media? So monarchy still relies on this form of invisibility and a form of divine right, although it's not identical to what the Middle Age monarchs experienced, and of being beyond or of being above ordinary life in some way. And I argue in the book that the firm cannot be too visible to public scrutiny, or it loses its mystique and its complex infrastructures are unmasked. Therefore, this visibility has to be tightly stage managed and balanced with a paradoxical but codependent invisibility. So how does this play out when live television offers audiences an opportunity to engage in real time and across time and space with royal ceremony? How does it play out when social media offers direct public contact with the firm, or at least with their social media team, as royal Instagram accounts abound on the same platform as their subjects? So this was meant to be kind of, this that I just read was meant to be kind of getting at the idea of media representation and changing media representation, which is what Helen really pushed me on when I was writing this section, and how media form impacts upon how monarchy might be being received or might be portraying themselves in different ways, and how that then impacts on this idea of power and of sovereign power and of producing consent. So the last little bit I want to read is a bit about Harry and Meghan, because that's what everyone wants to talk to me about. So that's what I'm going to read. So this bit is meant to be kind of getting at, again, that idea of corporate power, but about how they're being responded to in public commentary at the moment, in comparison to how the monarchy responded to, and what might be happening there. What's happening there is racism, just as a spoiler alert. So I'll start reading. So Harry and Meghan's resignation prompted a series of media and public debates about the commercialisation of the British monarchy. In the majority, it seems to be Meghan who is blamed, couched in racist and sexist language, for exposing the firm to the vulgar world of corporate capitalism, quote. So in the Daily Mail, the commentator Max Hastings criticised the vulgar Hollywoodising of the young royals due to Meghan's introduction. And the media consultant Sarah Flanagan said in The Guardian, quote, "Before Meghan was a royal, she was an influencer. What will be new is these hurdles they're going to have to get over as far as being royal and not being seen to cheapen the royal brand." The commentator Rob Shooter told The Express, quote, "You cannot forget that Meghan is not new to this, sorry. She has been working in Hollywood for years and she understands the power of the press and photography. While other members of the royal family are happy to let their PR people make all these decisions, Meghan is not." So these discourses seem to assume that the firm is inexperienced in media relations and Meghan is somehow outwitting them. And in fact, the book argues that the firm has adapted to changing media landscapes, has staff highly experienced in media production and distribution, and the royals and the staff know precisely the power of the press and photography and have made full use of it. So I foregrounded the role of media representations in constructing the British monarchy, and I used the work of Stuart Hall to argue that media culture is a key site through which class power is exercised under growing conditions of social inequality. I propose that media culture produces consent for monarchical power through both spectacular visibility at state occasions and more everyday representations of the firm as a successful family, constituted by royal figures who each contribute characteristics to appropriately stage the royal story. So the suggestion that Meghan is outwitting them ultimately helps to conceal this stage production because it obscures the firm's backstage relations and makes royal representations appear happenstance or authentic or natural in comparison to Meghan's strategy. Similarly, this idea of Meghan cheapening the royal brand seems to assume that the firm is not otherwise commercial or involved in corporate capital reproduction. And actually, The Guardian said in that article, the gulf between regal president and the current influencer economy. So they actually referenced that. So associating the firm with such an explicit form of self-promotion as an influencer and commodification precisely counteracts the careful balance of visibility and invisibility that I talked about earlier. But in light of the argument in the book, I wanted to ask, is the firm actually involved in exactly the same process? So in chapter 6, I talk about how the Kensington Royal Instagram account is run as though it's the Cambridge family photo album. So it doesn't really differ from other influences in terms of aesthetic, although of course royal posts are not sponsored. And equally, as I reveal in chapter 1 that The firm has many corporate investments, interests and contacts. So Duchy Originals, which is a line of organic food range that is produced by Prince Charles, and Prince Charles' charity. Sponsorship deals from HSBC, BAE Systems, Aston Martin. Individual royals have sponsorship deals. So Zara Phillips does a sponsorship thing for Rolex. Peter Phillips did a thing for Jersey Milk. So historically, the firm has had connections with the East India Company, so kind of big global corporations that were involved in colonisation projects. So to single out Harry and Meghan for commercialising the firm is to conceal a whole set of corporate connections that contribute towards reproducing the British monarchy. So actually singling them out and calling them out for this is a really purposeful move in order to kind of hide what's going on within the firm itself. Okay, that's me.
Thank you very, very much. Those layers, yes, can we do those layers of concealment in your book are extraordinary, actually. It's like you're peeling them away bit by bit, and the way they function is incredible. So over to you now, Bruce, to discuss possibly layers of concealment.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see me? Yeah, great. I'm really pleased to see the publication of this book. Like Bev and Laura mentioned, I've had some involvement in the project as a PhD supervisor on the research that provided the basis for the book. So to see Laura's research moving beyond the restricted spheres of academic debate it's immensely satisfying. The project, like Laura said, was initially concerned with political and social elites. And it quickly was refocused on the British monarchy as a representative case study for these concerns. One of the most interesting features of this development of this project, though, was how it was met with continual skepticism, with an insistence that in the 21st century, the monarchy is politically, culturally, and economically insignificant. Laura encountered this again and again when she discussed her work with colleagues, and I did too when I talked about the project with colleagues. But of course, since the project began, the royal family has barely been out of the news. And as well as discovering how spectacularly dysfunctional this family is, we've also learned a lot more about the political power they continue to exercise. And for example, with the Paradise Papers that Laura mentioned, the corrupt practices they employ to protect their vast wealth. Between the beginning of this project and the publication of the book, there have been royal births, marriages, deaths, and of course the scandal of transnational sexual abuse as well. And one of the impressive features of Laura's research and of Laura as a researcher is that she's been able to deal with the ongoing proliferation of material. One of the challenges of this work is simply how much stuff there is to deal with. And one of the key themes of the work is its examination of how what emerges from this stuff is a paradoxical image. The construction of a paradoxical image is one of the themes, wherein the royal family is an inescapable and spectacularly visible media presence. So, for example, yesterday, despite the ballooning fuel crisis, both the Times and the Express found space on their front pages for headline stories, 2 different stories about the royal family. But at the same time, the impression is maintained that the royal family is insignificant. So last month, for example, the centrist political commentator Nick Cohen wrote an article in The Observer entitled "Behind the Glitz of the Sussexes Lies a Simple Truth, Our Aristocracy is Dead." And then a week later, the story broke that Prince Charles had apparently campaigned for a Saudi businessman to get a CBE and British citizenship because he donated money to one of Charles's charities. In the 1995 film The Usual Suspects, while being interrogated by the police, one of the characters says, quoting from a short story by Charles Baudelaire, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist." And it seems to me that the value of Laura's research is that it argues the British monarchy is engaged with a similar project. And in their case, it's concerned with preserving the phenomenal wealth they own and the political power that comes with that. And the value of Laura's book is, like the film, it reveals to us how that trick was executed. Second point I want to make about the book, and this has been mentioned already, it's an exemplary interdisciplinary project. It began as a media studies and cultural history project and quickly expanded beyond that as the argument came into focus. It's a measure of this that the original PhD proposal was awarded an Arts and Humanities Research Council scholarship and an ESRC scholarship, a social science research scholarship simultaneously. And it's something of a cliche to celebrate interdisciplinarity as a positive feature of academic research, but it's rare to come across an example of it that's so successful, bringing together as it does approaches and concepts that are used in arts and humanities research with methods that are drawn from the social sciences. And in this case, this was necessary. It was a necessary response to the challenge of investigating a social phenomenon that's so ubiquitous and hypervisible, and at the same time is obsessed with secrecy as well. Because of the difficulty of investigating the royal family and the structure of the organisation that it sits at the head of, Laura had to develop some very innovative methods, which included archival research online and in libraries, media research that involved reading novels, biographies, magazines, newspapers, collecting ephemera, tea towels and flags and hats, watching TV news, TV dramas, films, TV movies, the huge amount, as I mentioned before, huge amount of material to sort of work through. So as well as offering a detailed analysis of how the royal family operates as a system or a structure, the book also offers a fascinating account of the ideological operation of contemporary news and entertainment media in the UK. This is a full spectrum analysis. Laura also undertook field work. She went to parades, public events, visited castles and stately homes and other locations, including Charles's model housing project, Poundbury. So she demonstrates in the book unambiguously the way that the power and the wealth of the monarchy takes a concrete material form. And this interdisciplinary approach means the book offers a thoroughly original, extremely valuable account of how the family firm operates at different levels, from its management of its media presence, through its management of interpersonal relationships, through to the management of estates and transnational investments. And what's important about this, what's especially important, is that the historical perspective the book offers allows us to see that the royal family, under the leadership of Elizabeth II, is a dynamic, resourceful organisation that's very skilled at remodelling itself in response to changing opinion. So we might like to think, like the Observer writer, that they're a fading anachronism that's petrified in dusty tradition and ritual. But as Laura shows us in this book, that's wishful thinking, and it overlooks how supremely successful they've been at adapting themselves to a rapidly changing world and a rapidly changing media environment over the last 70 years. There's no sign they have any interest in relinquishing voluntarily the power and the privilege that they wield. And a final point to note about this book is that Laura is a very good writer. She pays very careful attention to language. This was the case all the way through the PhD, and it's true of the book. One of her strengths as an academic researcher who crosses the boundary between different disciplines is that she's very good at writing clearly, accessibly, and entertainingly about complex theoretical material and densely complex historical narratives, while respecting their complexity, while retaining a sense of the intricacy of what it is that she's writing about. And this is an admirable achievement. And so the consequence of that is that reading Running the Family Firm is both an education and a pleasure that I recommend to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce. That was so incisive. Again, it's these layers of concealment that I think Laura unpacks remarkably through. I remember first reading it and all the money. I was shocked by the amount of wealth, the amount of land, the amount of property, the amount of copyright. They moved into IP. It's like they didn't just own, all these houses, massive houses. They actually own copyright on so many different things. So it's a real education in how wealth manifests in various hidden forms through quaintness. So over to Helen now, who I'm sure can give a much more acute cultural studies analysis. Thank you.
I'll try. Just to say, it's quite hard to follow Bruce, so eloquent as usual. Just to say thank you for inviting me, Laura. And it is, like Bruce, so great to see this work flying out there into the world. And I feel very, very privileged to play a little small part in its labour. And I was very proud to see Laura on Newsnight last week. I thought you were confidently batting off a question about Prince Andrew's lawyers to remind us of the work that the representational machine must be doing to weather yet another storm, I think was your phrase, Laura. And I just thought, wow, this is great. She's amazing, and we need more work like this. And isn't this great for media studies to be on Newsnight talking like this? I just thought it was phenomenal. So I just was going to start with commenting on something that struck me this week from an image in the book that was new to me because I hadn't seen the final rewrite through COVID. That happened under COVID, that of Kate and William playing bingo over Zoom to a residential care home in Wales. And it really struck me vividly because also this week I've watched the TV film Help, the Channel 4 film by Mark Munden and Jack Thorne, starring Stephen Graham and Jodie Cromer, which dramatises the appalling conditions in care homes during the pandemic, left without PPE, left without enough medical expertise, left without staff, literally left to suffocate and die. And it left me, like many others, racked with anger, grief, guilt, drawing attention to a crisis in care that this research centre has been documenting and appealing against. And I saw these two things together in my head, and Lord help me, after that I couldn't help but Google the scene of William and Kate calling the bingo numbers, which is now available on YouTube. And William drawing out a 2, one little duck, he says, he knows the language, and Kate pulling out a 62, tickety-boo, apparently, that's how you say posh bingo, across the screen from their stately home amongst much space to residents in the staff home wearing their face coverings. Watching Kate and William do the hard work, theirs is hard work, influencers isn't hard work apparently, the hard work for which they receive their privileges of appearing to have something in common and bridging the distance between them and the residents in Wales whilst they spend the pandemic on a private estate. The juxtaposition of such brutal violence and crisis against this kind of cosy conviviality are ones that don't often appear to us or don't often strike us, and we don't often put together. But this book does that. This book reminds us constantly that it's important to do that, as it situates the realities of wealth and privilege within the myriad of ways in which the family firm operates as a media phenomenon, refracting and offsetting inequality as a carefully crafted enterprise. And we really see, and Laura makes vivid, the craft and the work that's gone in that, built up of accumulated expertise over time in doing that. So the book is therefore delivered with attention to very close detail and precision that powerfully underscores the ongoing operational work of myth. It's an exercise in myth busting, it seems to me, par excellence. And like all good cultural studies, the analysis is not only an analysis of the royal family, it uses its approach to radical contextualisation, to seeing the historical precedents of wealth accumulation in law, the tax exemptions, the structure of investments and so on, to give us the political and economic lens through which to re-see the textually rich cultural imaginary of entitlement per se. This is, as Laura says, part of the wider picture through which widening social inequality has become part of a sadly accepted narrative in British culture. And this is the reason why, as Laura points to in her discussion of how she did the analysis, partly why the data, and Bruce suggests this as well, the data is so difficult to contain. It goes off in so many different directions, so difficult to draw the lines and the boundaries around what to talk about. It's partly because of the way in which these figures demonstrate just how entitlement is bound up with absolutely everything else. how corporate power can operate to give whilst keep, how Instagrammable femininity circulates ideas about conduct and behaviour that serves capital, how the nation's subjects can get redefined in terms of political crisis to keep the wheels moving, how we can marshal support for the military-industrial complex against the criticism of the war on terror, and so on. Its reach, its tentacles are phenomenal. So what the book shows us is the reach of cultural production to unsee far-reaching capital relations, but also how key points of tension become revealing of critical political relations, such as the exposure of whiteness and the tensions that Megan brings around questions of racial inequalities. This affirms that we need a political economy as well as the analysis of culture in a mould reminiscent of Stuart Hall, and which blows away those old arguments of which should we prefer. So I was asked to think of some questions, and I had three, but you don't need to answer all of them. But the first is, it strikes me that these figures are not consistent ideologically. They pull in different directions at different conjunctural moments in competing ways. Charles's pastoral nostalgia butts up against Harry and Meghan's woke capitalism. Kind of contributes to a form of soap opera, which leaves the Queen's management to the process, as management of the process, is often lauded. It seems to me that's the message. So I wanted to ask Laura how we deal with that. I love the word form, as you know, and how we think about this relation to the mediated centre, how they're held together by strategy rather than ideology, maybe, how the ritual work is as important as the ideological messaging work, which I think is really valuable and comes out through the book. The second question is a question about elites, which I think you're thinking about all the time, Laura. Cultural studies, in its attachment to the analysis of culture from below, hasn't until recently turned to its attention to elites. It's looked at when it's looked at new structures of capital, it's looked at celebrity, things, you know, the kind of democratizing effect of media culture, but less at systems of hereditary privilege. And I wonder how we might put this analysis of the royals in conversation with analysis of other elites. So I'm thinking of Alison Winch and Ben Little's book on the new patriarchs of digital capitalism, on the Google and the Elon Musks and Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. And it feels to me like their version of capital and its cultural architecture actually only helps the royals to obfuscate theirs. You know, we call on Amazon to pay tax. We don't care about the history of tax exemption for the royals. And the last is a really personal question, and it comes back to where I started when I saw Laura on Newsnight, thinking, wow, I wish I could do that. And I want to ask Laura how she manages to cope with the attention around the book. So loaded is this topic with feeling. You start life working on a PhD in Lancaster with nice PhD supervisors, thinking about the royal family, where it's safe and free to say what you want. And then suddenly it becomes a big public statement and you're on Newsnight and you're making the case to the nation about the trickery that they've been involved in. How do you manage that, and how do you cope with that, and how's that journey been? And I have a sort of final point, which is to say that I think this book is really, really important to the field. You know, quite simply, we've arrived in a place where we live in media, as Des would say, where much of social relations are collapsed into mediated formations. And because we're so overwhelmed and surrounded by content, the temptation as media scholars is to continually analyse what we so readily see. And one of the things that this book reasserts is that in contemporary hypermediated conjuncture, power is maintained through managing invisibility. And it behoves us as scholars to retain our curiosity in what we cannot see as the material effects of power, to see the new workings of capital as sometimes anchored in but often sustained through media formation. So I think the book has a bigger lesson, a broader reach, and it has a lot to tell our field. And just one last tiny point, I'm also really, really excited that people are going to be picking up this book to find a scoop. So I'm going to say there is a really big secret buried in there. It's not about who the family really are. But what really excites me is that people will be picking this up and they'll be reading media studies, and we need it now more than ever. So thank you, Laura. Thank you for doing that for us.
Thank you, Helen. And plenty of questions for you there, Laura, but the emphasis on, again, we're getting concealment, entitlement, the spider webs of power and invisibility. None of these issues are easy. And I think Laura makes it look easy, or when you're reading it, you feel as if you're understanding it. And I think that's an absolute incredible skill to be able to do that, as Helen pointed out. So it really is incredible to read. Oh, no, I'm thinking, what's the secret? Anyway, to properly announce our next speaker, Sivamohan Valluvan, otherwise known as Vallu. But if you're going to get his book, which again is totally recommended reading, you need to know his full name. And the biography of all the speakers and their different books is on the outline of the event. So thank you for all of that, because I think what's becoming really apparent in these very, very, very short talks is just the sheer complexity of understanding the world when you actually pick on what looks like a straightforward family structure. And actually what you get into are the workings of incredibly complex power, corporate interests and legal concealment. I mean, that's going to be an interesting one that everybody's going to watch. But anyway, for the moment, Vallu, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, brilliant. All right, I think some of what I will say will very much chime, perhaps even repeat what others have said, but maybe also a couple of things that diverge a touch. Thank you, of course, for the invite. I actually just want to second that I'm just really thrilled to play a small part, a small huckster's part, perhaps, in celebrating Laura's, and I know others have said it was really quite precociously coherent and thoughtful book. There was also, and I don't think this is by the by, it was an absolutely breezy and entertaining read, and puts a lot of us to shame, admittedly. I think it'll be remiss of me not to mention, I gather, correct me if I'm wrong, that Tom Dark was a commissioning editor and had a role in this, and I of course take a certain proprietorial pride in that. I have such affection for Tom, and I just want to say that Tom Dark has been, as a commissioning editor for MUP, so important for a number of early career researchers, and books that have all, I don't include my own in this list, but nonetheless, many books that have found themselves in the midst of public debates with a significant profile and having a purposeful and clarificatory place in the wider domain of public debate. So obviously, as others have said, Laura's book is in one key sense about how the monarchy as an institution, but actually as an aristocratic family, safeguard their private monetary interests. So in this sense, I think Bruce said this, it is, I suppose, about how the crusty, and I do think it's crusty, the crusty resplendence of ceremony, ritual, and celebrity provides a fog, if you like, a fog of legitimacy to the otherwise cold, vulgar interests of the cash nexus. And that's an interesting tension, not tension, or rather actualization. However, as someone who purports, anyways, and Bev overdid the billing perhaps, but purports to be a scholar of nationalism, and inadequate one at that, I might add. But my purview today is less this striking political economy element and more the status of our monarchy, inevitably vis-a-vis a staging of national identity, and therein, and I think perhaps more importantly, the staging of nationalist anxiety too. After all, a recurring motif of Laura's book is precisely how the royal family remains this overdetermined proxy today for British national identity, despite it being such a curious and, of course, hammy site of symbolic struggle as regards, the not so banal flagging of the British nation. And what I guess the first thing I'll say is what I accordingly appreciated about Laura's book, and I think Helen already anticipated this, but is that it refuses to name the monarchy as performing only one genre of symbolic assertion. I think it's very easy or safe and inviting to retreat to a conservative tinging of what the monarchy projects. But I think what Laura brings through, that the monarchy through its arrayed caste, and of course, actually the term caste takes on a further inflection, I suppose, today, given the astonishing rating success of the Crown. But, via its assorted personnel, the monarchy projects multiple and often contrasting resonances as befitting the always contradictory but contemporary assertion of national belonging. Contrasting resonances that all help, nonetheless, in this unholy convergence, all help score the nation's simultaneously seductive sense of exclusive national identity, insularity, but also this long arcing medieval continuity and the jingoism be this Elizabeth as the, how shall we put it, the imperious/imperial, but ultimately becoming and sensible matriarch, right? Or be this the pastoral, already a word that has been used by Helen, but it invites itself, the pastoral conservatism of Charles and its aesthetic recall of a mythic but bucolic village England, of course. Be this, I think this was really well captured by Laura, be this William and Kate as the putatively middle-class couple who uphold this strikingly petty bourgeois little Englander respectability. And I think, as Helen said, the bingo vignette accentuates or captures that in a particularly forthcoming way. Or even, and again, I think this may be this the laddish militarism of a la Harry 1.0, pre-Damascene conversion into whatever it is now, which a shorthand of wokeness shall suffice. Or even it be the post-racial alibi via Meghan's initial initiation into the family, and therefore, as Laura shows, what's telling for me is how the monarchy and the cultural enablers harness these mediations to always center itself nonetheless as a worthwhile, available, nostalgic referent of the nation, right? But equally, and I think maybe this is where I differ slightly, the very fact that the monarchy as a nominal figure of the nation is made to stand for all these ideals, perhaps begins to say less about them and begins to say something about us, about our own desiderata as regards the ultimate fiction of nation and national identity. Of course, for many, the very basic fact that Britain even looks to the monarchy as a meaningful marker of national belonging speaks to a deep cultural void. To paraphrase, and inevitably one always has to cite Paul Gilroy in this context, so to paraphrase a recent essay by Paul Gilroy, the monarchy's ultimately pastiche presence is yet another exhibit in a long litany of exhibits that attests to the essentially melancholic void of Anglo-British nationalism, an idea of nation that has, namely, in my opinion, no substantive reference beyond a vague and necessarily ill-defined, a necessarily elusive sense of a prematurely surrendered past, or what Gilroy, I've had the quote here, I just had to read it, but Gilroy describes as, quote, "We see the hardening of nostalgic objects that fill in for the gnawing pain of cultural emptiness or anesthetizes the anxieties resulting from cultural disorientation." That's quite a mouthful. So in other words, this Anglo-British nationalism has locked into, if you like, a post-colonial melancholia is characterized, in my opinion, by a pathological masochism. By that I mean, it is simply a defensive and self-loathing refusal to reconcile itself to the present and certainly not the future. It is herein fitting, perhaps, that it is a dated and really rather lame institution. No doubt, I think it's absolutely important that Laura has given it its attention, because far too many people in sociology and the left think it a quixotic anachronism, but it's nonetheless a dated and rather lame institution, what we call the monarchy, that British nationalism is still so keen on foregrounding is interesting as an object of endlessly defensive lament that can command, yes, expansive, but let's be honest, truth be told, ultimately hollow attachment, okay? So now to just shift gear a little bit, of course, some have interpreted the spectacular Meghan fallout as bringing into some kind of overdue relief the younger multicultural generation's allegedly latent suspicion of this monarchy da-di-da. I have to say, I think I'm going to dissent a little bit from the tone, the intimations elsewhere. I'm not nearly as partial to the Meghan thing as one might suspect. And I'll just try to clarify that. But I understand that, in other words, many people read the Megxit version of the so-called culture wars as making better visible the essentially antagonistic and highly politicized, highly conservative, highly anachronistic status of the monarchy. Of course, given a choice where the schism is Piers Morgan on one side, and Oprah on the other, I think we know where the younger generation is intuitively tending towards. So yes, maybe all this has happened. I don't know, but I just want to see a couple fleeting things just to complicate slightly. So in the wake of the initial wedding, right, the Meghan Harry wedding, Adam Elliott Cooper, another name on the MUP imprint, I believe, but my good friend and a fantastic, brilliant academic, and of course a really a very prominent political voice at the moment. But he cuttingly noted, right, that if neoliberalism finds post-racial diversity so bankable, it is unsurprising that neo-feudalism too will have reached for its own spin on the same diversity capital. But of course, the neo-feudal, the rather horsey, by horse I mean the animal. I gather in Britain people attribute this to the aristocracy. I'm not quite clear. I'm from Sweden and we have a monarchy, but it's not associated with horses or equine things or whatnot. But whatever. But ultimately, this neo-feudal horsey attempt at post-racial buzz, yes, this was always fated to be less convincing. Of course, they're less literate in the minor grammar and etiquettes of the post-racial sensation. Hence Megxit, right? But I just want to flag here a provocation, as provided by Ash Sarkar, I thought, in one of the more insightful takes subsequent to the Megxit debacle. But remember, it's not merely debacle, it's debacle/media spectacle, right? Revenue-friendly, click-friendly media spectacle. So we just might broaden our sense of what is our sense of aristocracy and royalty, right? And what does that mean in an era of incessant televisual consumption and where entertainment stars are custodians, no longer the employee, but custodians in their own right of commercial empires? So the decamping, in my opinion, of Harry and Meghan to Oprah and Los Angeles to speak out on the ills of palace racism was also them decamping to another aristocracy. And let's be honest, one that is shinier, one that is more confident in its reckoning with the cultural economy of the 21st century, and indeed one that is much more commercially literate in the contemporary social justice markers that seem to prove strangely profitable for Netflix and related millennial markets. Far more so than Charles will become the next 50 years. So, to put it more boldly, it strikes me that, yes, whilst the very shape and symbolism of our monarchy does act as a very revealing, useful shorthand for much of what is wrong with British nationalism, is ultimately parochial, I was going to say classist, but let's say casteist, really, casteist and unreformed backwardness, right? But we also see how the absence of monarchy doesn't in itself yield a productive awakening, right? Other monarchies and aristocracies, in all but name, and perhaps that's even more slippery, in all but name, are there to carry a torch, so to speak. So I just wonder, and I think this chimes a little bit with Helen's question, but I wonder more broadly as an open question to Laura. I know you read from this as well, but I just want to push you a little more. How you yourself, how you read that Megxit moment, and in something more personal, whether you, as presumably a Republican, felt a moment of this critical frisson during the fallout, or did you still see in it this extraordinarily profound limit to what passes for at least publicly amplified critique of the royal family, right? And indeed, actually, just before I finish, may I just say, I'm also thinking indirectly of today's India, right? Where its Hindu nationalist political custodians are allied to an extraordinary industrial and tech plutocracy who increasingly represent aristocracy in themselves. I just don't mean because that they're really rich. No, it's because their family names have become a hallowed byword for dynasties and conglomerates. I mean, it's routinely in the Indian vernacular, people say the Adanis, the Mittars, the Tatas, the Guptas, the Reddys, you know, and where even the weddings of their children and scions are just become mega spectacles that bring whole cities, even those in the old world, which is interesting, like Barcelona, to a theatrical standstill, okay? And it captivates the media waves. So again, in just cultural terms, I'm interested in this, how monarchy and nobility exists without an actual crown and without the neo-feudal instruments of sovereignty that, you know, as Laura's book makes so clear, these prerogative, the recourse to prerogative rights of our own royal family. But without that, it seems we are still seeing a much more 21st century rendition of it in the new powers of this world, not least India. And even how nationalisms can anchor themselves through other metonyms of ancient mandates and alleged symbolic continuity with the deep past, right? I mean, just think Hindutva as a political project of ancient origins and ethno-religious exclusivity that can draw a ghoulish but still winning compact with a thoroughly 21st century class, and I think this is the only word for them, oligarchic barons, really. So yeah, I think, you know, I'm just ad-libbing way too loosely now, and, you know, suddenly I wanted to talk about the really interesting travails of the Japanese imperial family. But, you know, I think it's going to get too tangential. So I'll just stop there, but I hope that was of sufficient interest to you. And buy the book, people.
That's wonderful. How many royal families can we invoke in this discussion?
Oh, they are fantastic. The Japanese one is absolutely fascinating and right now very newsworthy.
I also think, yeah, expanding it into dynasties is really significant, because think of, you know, the significance between, say, the Murdochs or the Mercers, who are media, new media, and the royal family. We are having dynasties in various different spaces. So I think